In this lesson, I'd like to take just a few minutes to explain sort of how the concept of hierarchies play a really important part in the core functionality of Cinema 4D. Okay, so as we've been doing up to this point, I'm just going to start with a blank scene here. And let's start by dropping in just a basic object, in this case, maybe just a simple cube. Now, in my previous lesson, I had mentioned that the concept of hierarchies and working inside the object manager is a very important, very fundamental part of Cinema 4D and how it works. So what I'd like to do in this lesson is give you just a quick look at exactly what I mean by that. So let's say, for example, we start to take a look at this shelf up here, and there's a few different features that we have, things like our primitive geometry, which we've had a chance to kind of just very briefly see what these do and play with these as far as dropping them into our scene. But we also have things like hyperNURBs. We can get into different types of arrays, different types of bend deformers, and other generators. Now, we're not going to get too deep into these just yet. When Justin gets into the next section of modeling, you'll have a chance to see a lot more of these in action. But for now, what I'd like to do is just kind of show you the principle of how hierarchies work in Cinema 4D and how they are a fundamental, very important part of how this entire application works. So let's say, for example, we drop in maybe an array. Okay, so let's go ahead and drop in an array. Now the array is meant to sort of duplicate objects in a particular pattern. Now when we drop in the array, you'll see it shows up over here in our object manager. Now let's say I wanted to take this cube and have that be duplicated by the array. Well, the array, like I said, it's not just a simple command. Most of these different functions that we have in Cinema 4D is an actual tool or an actual node that can get dropped into the object manager. Now if I select this array, you'll notice if I go down here into the attribute manager, there's really nothing that allows me to choose what is going to be affected by this array or what is going to be the object that we duplicate. Well, this is how Cinema 4D works, and that is with hierarchies. So in my previous lesson, we talked just very briefly about hierarchies and how those work, but they work in more than just simple parenting and having objects follow each other around. Now let's say I wanted this cube to be duplicated by the array. Well, what I would do is take my cube, click and drag, and again you can see where as I start to click and drag, we change from either the sideways arrow to maybe a downward arrow. If we go to the downward arrow and drop this in here, now my cube is parented, or rather made a child of this array. So the array is now the parent, and now you can see once this hierarchy has been set up, now the array works properly. So now we can go into the array, start to adjust things like the radius, the number of copies that we have, and so on and so forth. So again, this is pretty much how a lot of the tools and a lot of the functions inside of Cinema 4D work. And this is a really important concept to grab because it's again going to be a very fundamental part of just about everything that you do in this application. Now, with certain instances or with certain commands, the ordering of these really is important. So it's important in this case with something like these arrays that the object that you want to duplicate is underneath the array. Now, if we wanted to break this connection, we can just take the cube, drag it out to where we have kind of this sideways arrow next to my cursor. And now that the cube is no longer parented or made a child of that array, the array has no effect. Now, again, this isn't always the case. So, for example, maybe we drop in something like a hyperNURBs. Just for the sake of demonstration, this is something that will allow us to take a piece of geometry and smooth it. Again, the hyperNURBs shows up here in my object manager. So if I wanted my cube to be smoothed, just come in here, drop it underneath my hyperNURBs, and now my cube has been smoothed out to form a little bit more of a spherical type shape. So this kind of gives you an idea of exactly how these different parenting and hierarchy structures work inside of Cinema 4D. But if we maybe wanted to come in here and add maybe just a simple twist to this. Now let's take the cube and drop it underneath the twist. We'll come in here and give this twist a little bit of a higher angle. Now you'll notice you can see this twisting happening, but the cube really doesn't seem to be affected by that. And again, this is one of those instances where the ordering of these really does matter. For some functions, the object will need to be underneath the command, but sometimes it works the opposite. So let's take the cube and drop it out here. Now instead of the cube being underneath the twist, in this case let's take the twist and put it underneath the cube. And now we have the object and the command that is actually modifying it. So the overall effect that you get, again, depends very, very greatly on the ordering of this. And like I said, some commands are meant to be placed on top as far as the hierarchy. Some commands are meant to be placed underneath. So definitely a little bit of experimentation that is going to be required. And again, this workflow is going to become very, very fundamental in pretty much everything that you do. You're going to see this idea of hierarchies and parenting and child objects being used very, very frequently from this point on as we start to get into modeling, into texturing, rigging, animation, and so on. So for now, that's just a quick look at how we can start to use this concept of hierarchies as a very, very fundamental way of achieving most of our different ways of working and going about a lot of really, really common tasks inside of Cinema 4D.